seminar on foster youth equity planning. My name is Debbie Rauscher, and I'm with the John Burton Foundation California College Pathways Project. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So before we jump into content, I wanted to just go over a couple of logistical pieces of information. Most of you are probably listening on your computers. If you do have any problems with sound, you can also listen in through the telephone, which is sometimes a little bit better. So the call-in number and access code are there on your screen, and it's also on the control panel that's on your desktop. If you have questions during the presentation, on your control panel, there's a box where you can type in questions. So you can go ahead and send your questions at any point during the presentation. We'll be doing all the questions at the very end. So go ahead and submit your questions, though, whenever you think of them, and then we'll try to get to as many questions as we can after we hear from the panelists for the presentation. The final thing is that all the presentation materials will be posted on our website, cacollegepathways.org. And after the web seminar this morning, I will send out an email to everybody who is on the web seminar with the PowerPoint and links to where the recording will be, as well as some other reference materials that we're going to be talking about during the presentation. So you can look for that in your email after the presentation is over. Next slide, please. So I'm really excited to welcome you all today. We've got almost 100 people logged on, and I imagine we'll get a few more coming in as we move through the presentation. This morning, we're going to start with an overview of equity planning more generally. And I'm very excited to have Sarah Tyson from the California Community College's Chancellor's Office on the call with me this morning. We also have Tim Bunnell, who's also with the Chancellor's Office, and the Foster Youth Success Initiative, a project of the Chancellor's Office, are co-sponsors of this morning's web seminar, and so he's going to be available to help answer whatever questions you might send in during the presentation, during the Q&A portion at the end. So welcome to Sarah and Tim. After the equity planning overview, we're going to talk specifically around data collection as it relates to foster youth and some of the resources that are available for getting data. We're going to talk about creating the actual equity plan, the foster youth portion of the equity plan, and provide some suggestions for how you might go about doing that. And then, of course, at the end, the question and answer. And so we are scheduled to last until about 12:30 this morning. Might get you out of here a little bit earlier than that, but you should plan for 12:30. Next slide, please. And again, you know, if you are having any problems with your audio, I would suggest that you try calling in on the telephone instead of the computer. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sarah Tyson.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to be going fairly rapidly through this next set of slides. We did provide quite a lot of information for you in them, and it's rather detailed, but mostly we wanted you to have this as a resource afterwards. So this first section, I'm going to talk about just a little bit about the history of student equity and how it's evolved into where we are today. So in 1991, there was legislation that added a section to the California Education Code that specifically included an equity component and said that it was the intent of the state that the K-12 system, the public post-secondary system, and the independent institutions provide access to all individuals who could reasonably benefit from an education. And in response to that legislation, in 1992, the California Community Colleges Board of Governors adopted a student equity policy that required districts to develop, implement, and evaluate a student equity plan. And then in 1996, the Board of Governors amended that policy to establish adoption of a student equity plan as a minimum standard for receipt of state funding. So this is the first time that we've seen that there was any reference to a requirement that funding be established. This was all then reviewed in 2002. Sorry about that. This water's not working so well. It was then reviewed in 2002, and the Board of Governors adopted recommendations on the task force of student equity and diversity and developed regulations. So first we had the legislation, then we had a board policy, and then here we have in 2002 we actually have regulations, which we call Title V regulations, as you know. And then in 2003, the Chancellor's Office provided written guidelines and increased guidance to the colleges. I'm sorry, I didn't say next slide. Sorry, Devin. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. In 2003, the Chancellor's Office provided guidelines to the colleges for development of a student equity plan. And then in 2005, the colleges were asked to review and update their student equity plans. Beginning in 2009-10, really, the system suffered a very significant budget cut. And so the requirement to submit or update student equity plans was suspended due to the budget cuts, and that the system was going through a period where categorical programs were, the funds were flexed and were not necessarily required to be spent in certain areas that they had been required to be spent in before. Then in 2011, the system established its Student Success Task Force in response to a bill by Senator Liu. And in 2012, Senate Bill 1456, which was the Student Success Act of 2012, reaffirmed the Student Success Initiative and also the student equity goals. In 2013, the Student Equity Work Group was convened to review what was already out, the board policies and the regulations, and to review its applicability in light of the new Student Success Initiative. Next slide, please. Then, in 2014, the governor and the legislature actually appropriated funds for student equity. Tim's making faces over here. Appropriated funds for student equity. So for the first time, we have the requirement to have a student equity plan is a condition for receiving funds in any of the new student and success and support programs, as well as the specific student equity funding. So the student success and support program received an augmentation, and there was within that augmentation a specific call out of $70 million for student equity. So now the requirement for districts to maintain a student equity plan is in statute as opposed to regulation and policy. And the requirements for districts to maintain a student equity plan is a condition to receive any student success and support program funding. And the language that came along with the funding also required colleges and districts to establish specific goals and activities to address disparities, requires coordination with other categorical programs such as CalWORKS, EOPS, CARE, and other programs, DSPS, which serve specific populations of students on campus. And the statute also requires that the process must include faculty, student services, students, and other constituencies. Next slide, please. Again, there was quite a bit of specificity put into the budget and into the education trailer bill that implements the student equity funding. So the language actually directs the Chancellor's Office to come up with a student equity funding formula that is predefined by the language that's now in statute, that's actually in education code. And so the formula is requires the Chancellor's Office to look at the number of high-need students that districts are serving. And as a component of high-need students, they're required to look at Pell Grant eligibility, how many students are actually eligible for Pell Grants within that institution. It requires us to look at educational attainment. And so we're looking at educational attainment by zip code as served by that district. Then the statute also requires the Chancellor's Office to consider in the funding formula the college and district's participation rate as compared to the community that it serves, and as the socioeconomic status of the district as well. So the formula is we're required to provide greater number of resources to districts that have a greater number or proportion of high-need students. Next slide, please. So creating the student equity plan. So we'll get into this in more detail later on, as you'll see. But the plan is required to have specific goals and activities and outcomes for each of 5 success indicator categories. In this plan, there should be included goals and associated activities in each category that are specific to foster youth and to other specific populations that are called out. And you'll see a little bit more detail on that in just a minute. And there need to be performance measures to determine progress for achieving the outcomes, including baseline data and how the timeline to achieve a certain amount of progress. Excuse me. And then the plan should identify target dates and positions involved or responsible for the completion of those targets. And then it will also include a budget. Next slide, please. So the requirements for developing a student equity plan, the college should establish a committee. As we mentioned, the language around the student equity funding is quite explicit that it needs to involve the campus-wide committee that involves faculty, student services, students, and other employees. The institution needs to conduct research on the disparities in success, so they do need to conduct a disproportionate impact study. They need to develop goals and outcomes, specific actions to address and monitor disparities, and a budget that supports those specific actions that are outlined. Then they need to outline the implementation timeframe, coordinate that student equity plan with the student success and support program plan that colleges are currently working on, and then review progress and make changes as going forward. Next slide, please. So the statute's quite explicit that populations to be evaluated are to be analyzed by subcategory of students by gender, which include and then for specific populations, including current and former foster youth, students with disabilities, low-income students, veterans, and the various ethnic and racial categories that you see listed. Now, this is a shift from what is in the current Title V regulations. The current Title V regulations specifically talk about gender and ethnic and racial categories, but they do not reference low-income students, veterans, students with disabilities, or current or former foster youth. And then there's also been some redefinition of ethnic and racial categories since the Title V regulations were written. So the statute reflects, I believe, current census definitions. Next slide. So the student equity plan indicators that I mentioned earlier, the 5 success indicators are access to and course completion, ESL and basic skill completion, degree and certificate completion, and transfer. And these are the existing indicators that have been in the regulations, and these are continued forward in the statute that was just implemented, that was just effective with the new student equity funding. The plans are expected to be revised and resubmitted every 3 years. There's expected to be an annual year-end report. And currently, the initial plan was asked to be due by November 21st, 2014. The statute makes reference to if the plan's not submitted, then something needs to be to the Chancellor's Office by January 1 of 2015. So there's not really a lot of difference between the November due date and the January due date. And we have not yet determined whether we're going to extend that November date. We've had so many things going on, we just haven't quite gotten there yet. Next slide. Thank you. So this is the draft allocation formula for the student equity funding. There was a work group that has been a task force of the Consultation Council that has been working with the Chancellor's Office staff at coming up with the criteria. And so currently the formula is as we see on the screen, 40% of the funding would go out to districts based on annual district full-time equivalent students. And that is that district's number of full-time equivalent students as a proportion of the statewide number of full-time equivalent students. And then 25% of the funding would go out to districts based on their share of the statewide number of Pell Grant Award recipients. And so that would be what number of Pell Grant Awards does that district have as a share of the statewide number of Pell Grants. Then 10% of the funding will be going out based on the educational attainment of that district service area. How many people in that service area by zip code have some college or no degree. So it's anything below that level of educational attainment that we're counting. And then the next item is 5% of the funding is proposed to go out using the college or the district's participation rate. So that is what percentage of the individuals within that district's service area are actually attending the institution. And then the remaining 20% of the funding was designed to identify another metric of high need in the service area, and that is what's called the socioeconomic status of the district. It's a combination of household income rate under $25,000, which is close to the federal poverty level. It's not exactly the same number, but it's a number that we can actually find in California data. And then the unemployment rate of that district. Those two items together make up the socioeconomic status of the district and are another way at looking at high need as opposed to high need in the area as opposed to high need students like the Pell Grant would get you to. Next slide, please. So this next section just talks about our draft student equity funding guidelines. Again, this information is largely as a resource for you. So the funding guidelines that clearly expenditures must meet the purpose and address the target populations based on your research, and it must be based on the disproportionate impact study goals and activities that you describe in the college student equity plan. Year one expenditures could precede adoption of the plan, but must be reflected in your plan. And districts and colleges will have to provide an annual report on expenditures and progress towards the goals. And what I know a lot of colleges are happy about is that there's no match required for these funds. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we have here are just some examples of some eligible expenditures. Next slide. Thanks. Oh no, still next slide. There we go. Oh, that went 2 slides. I'm having a little bit of delay. I'm sorry about that. There we go. So these are just some examples. You could have outreach to your underrepresented student groups and communities. Expenditures can support student services and categoricals that directly support improved outcomes on the success indicators of the prioritized populations in your student equity plan. It can fund student equity related research and evaluation. You could use the funds to hire a student equity coordinator or staff. It can be used to support the student equity planning processes. Next slide. Funds can also be used for professional development on the effects of inequities, methods for detecting and researching them, effective practices for improving outcomes, adapting academic or career-related programs that will more directly affect your student equity outcomes, and providing embedded tutoring such as supplemental instruction, providing counseling, and other support that these, as long as they directly speak to the activities in the student equity plan and have measurable outcomes. And then again, funds can be used for targeted publications, materials, and travel that will support student equity goals. Next slide, please. And this is just some resources for you. Included on that link are the Student Equity Plan template. If you haven't looked at it, I highly recommend you look at it. It is dated March 2014 because it was developed when the budget was still in the early stages, so it does not reflect some of the new populations that I tried to point out to you. That plan template does not directly speak to foster youth or veterans or low-income students. What was the fourth one? And then also on there is a student equity fact sheet and then a guide for measuring disproportionate impact in your student equity plans. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Debbie, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And actually, I know I said we're going to do all questions at the end, but I wanted to direct one question to you that's just a clarification of something you said, Sarah. You mentioned subcategories by gender for foster youth status. Are campuses required to report of the foster youth, how many foster youth are female and how many foster youth are male? Can you just sort of clarify what that gender disaggregation means?
The statute just says that the analysis needs to be done by gender. So in any one of those categories, it would just be, if you were looking at any of those categories, whether it's foster youth or veterans or whatever, it would just be, if you're looking at them, is one gender of that group having more difficulty accessing any one of those, achieving any one of those 5 indicators: access to education, transfer degrees. So it just is saying you can't just say lump all foster youth together. You need to, just the same way that you can't lump all veterans together, you need to break them out by gender in your analysis.
Okay,
but if there's no significant difference between the number you're enrolling and the number that are achieving their outcomes, then that's part of the study, and you don't have to have activity. You wouldn't have to have activities that are different by gender. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So thank you, Sarah, for that information. Now we're going to move on to kind of talking more specifically about foster youth and incorporating foster youth in the equity plan. So you see on the slide that's in front of you right now, why foster youth? So why are foster youth being designated, being called out specifically as a population? So as you can see from both of these charts, outcomes in general for foster youth do not match outcomes of the general population. The first chart you have there is from something called the Midwest study, where it's a very well-known study that comes out of Chapin Hall and from the University of Chicago, where they tracked a cohort of foster youth over time and found that by age 24, 24% of foster youth had been homeless at some point. You can see that when compared to the general youth population, the employment numbers are significantly lower, women much more likely to have been pregnant, the median income significantly lower, and much higher rates of being convicted of a crime. The second chart you see there is from a more recent study that was funded through the Stewart Foundation called the Invisible Achievement Gap, where they compared not only the general population to foster youth, but also compared to a comparison population of students who had similar socioeconomic backgrounds. And you can see from this that foster youth in terms of high school completion, enrollment in community college, and college persistence, do poorly not only when compared to the general student population, but even do more poorly when compared to other low-income students. So foster youth really are coming into this with some particular disadvantages that other students don't have. There's a few reasons for this. Foster youth tend to move around a lot. They get moved from placement to placement to placement, and this often results in movement from school to school to school. And it's not uncommon to hear people say that they went to 6 different high schools because they were in the foster care system and moved so much. They have a history of trauma by definition. They were removed from their biological parents because of some severe form of abuse or neglect. They don't necessarily have a history of good experiences with asking for help from adults. They may, in fact, have had the experience that asking for help got them removed, got them taken away from their family. And then because of having so much transition, they're less likely to have developed positive relationships with adults. There's higher rates of disability among the foster youth population. The other reason why foster youth are called out specifically is because in terms of the supports that get provided to them in the context of college, they often have very specific needs. Because of the lack of a support system of a biological family, the history of trauma, and their unique legal status, they're going to have different needs than other students. There's going to be benefits that might be available to them that somebody would need to understand, and just different legal implications for foster youth. So that's why foster youth are called out as a population within the equity plan. Can you, next slide, please? So the next point that I want to make is that there is language now in statute specifically around engaging stakeholders. So I have a couple of quotes here on the slide. Student equity plan shall be developed with the active involvement of all groups on campus as required by law, including the academic senate, faculty, staff, student services, and students, and also with the involvement of appropriate people from the community. In addition, it specifically states in statute that measures for addressing disparities should include coordination with campus-based foster youth support program. So engaging stakeholders in the formation of your plan is not just good practice, it's actually required by law. Next slide. So what might this look like in relationship to engaging stakeholders specifically around the foster youth component? First is the stakeholders that you'd want to make sure to engage on your campus. So every campus is going to have some individual designated as a foster youth contact. Who that person is and the capacity that that person is in is going to vary tremendously campus by campus. So you have some campuses that have comprehensive support programs for foster youth. Sometimes these are called guardian scholars programs, where there's designated staff, sometimes a designated space where foster youth can go, where there's academic counseling, tutoring, etc. And so if you have one of those programs, you certainly want to make sure that those folks are engaged. Other campuses have what we refer to as light touch support programs. So they don't have the degree of support that's available in a comprehensive support program, but they have a staff person who maybe has part of their salary funded in some way, or the campus has maybe designated one person within EOPS who can work with foster youth specifically, or there's some way in which they actually have some dedicated time that's funded in some way or sanctioned to work with foster youth. All campuses, if you don't have a comprehensive support program or a light touch support program, you will have an FYSI liaison, the Foster Youth Success Initiative. So this is a program that's run through the Chancellor's office. Most FYSI liaisons are located in the financial aid office, although in some cases they may be located in a different department, but every campus has a person who's been designated as the point person for foster youth. Finally, some campuses are going to have what's called a foster kinship care education point person, and this person doesn't work directly with foster youth or with students, but they're housed on the campus and they're tasked with providing training for foster parents and kinship caregivers. So if you are not one of these people and you're listening to this call, I would strongly encourage you to determine who this person is on your campus and seek this person out and you can work with Tim Bunnell in the Chancellor's office to identify who your FYSI liaison is if you don't know. If you are that person, you're listening to the call, you are the foster youth point person, I would encourage you to reach out to the members of your equity planning committee and make sure they know who you are. Let them know that you're a resource. Volunteer your time to sit down with them and help think through what should be included in the equity plan for foster youth. Secondly, as a quote on the previous slide mentioned, external stakeholders can be really key partners in this process. And so I wanted to just name who some of these agencies are that you might want to reach out to. Every county has a child welfare agency. And as we talk about the data piece a little later in the presentation, the child welfare agency might be a valuable partner in helping you to pull together some of the data that you're looking for. Every county also has what's called an independent living program, and this is a program that specifically works with foster youth, typically between the ages of 16 and 21, 22, to help them transition into independence as they're either preparing to or after they've already left foster care. So they can provide all kinds of guidance, and they're a wealth of information about what the needs of the local foster youth population might be. Thirdly, within every county office of education, there is a program called Foster Youth Services, where there is a dedicated foster youth contact who's funded specifically to work with foster youth within that county. And in addition, there's foster youth contacts designated in the different K-12 districts across the state. And with the implementation of the local control funding formula, which some folks may be familiar with, which is revamping the entire way that K-12 funding is happening, there's actually even more efforts underway to identify more clearly who these foster youth contacts are, because foster youth are a population that has to be tracked within the local control funding formula. So when we talk about the access parts of your plan and how to get the foster youth to your school in the first place, working with these folks at the County Office of Education and the K-12 district, as well as the independent living program, can be a great way to easily be able to identify foster youth who are in high school so you can do targeted outreach. Finally, foster care providers, and I'm kind of lumping under this group homes and foster family agencies, which are the agencies that place foster youth with a foster parent. There are folks called CASAs, court-appointed special advocates, who work directly with foster youth to help advocate for them within the court system. And so you can connect with all of these different entities, the FFAs, the group homes, the CASA organization in your local area, and they can also be a great resource for you to be able to outreach and connect to who the foster youth are. Next slide, please. So obtaining data. So this is the first step in the process. As Sarah talked about, the first step is to do this analysis, to pull this data, and figure out what's going on with your foster youth. And then from there, you figure out what you're going to do about it, what your activities are going to be. So there's good news and there's bad news in terms of obtaining the data. So the good news is that within the community college MIS system, there is a foster youth flag. This was added relatively recently, but it is in there, and so it is a way for campuses to be able to pull data that is specific to those who are identified as foster youth. Another piece of good news is that there is a report that's available through the CalPass Plus system. And for those who don't know what CalPass Plus is, it's a system that is funded through the Chancellor's office that is a repository of data that comes not only from the community colleges, but many of the K-12 districts, as well as some of the four-year universities as well. And so it's a way to be able to pull aggregated information and track trends in a variety of different ways, actually all the way from kindergarten all the way up through the four-year university. So there's a report that was funded actually by the Stewart Foundation as part of the California College Pathways that all of the campus folks that are on the call can very easily go in and generate. So there's a certain amount of data on foster youth that you can have access to actually quite easily without having to create it yourself. The bad news is that the information that's available on the CalPAS report does not coincide precisely to what is requested through the equity plan data requirements. And I'm going to walk through each of the different areas and sort of point out where it coincides and where it doesn't. So there is going to be a little bit of groundwork that still has to happen on your part. And finally, if you're interested in pulling the CalPAS Plus report, if you're a new user, you do need to request access and be verified by your campus's CalPAS Plus contact. And once you do that, it's pretty straightforward. You go to the Community Colleges tab, select Reports, Queries, and Research, select the Foster Youth Report, run the report, and it'll download a spreadsheet that will have a whole range of indicators and show you percentages as compared to your general student population at your campus. Next slide, please. So one thing I want to say about the foster youth checkbox that I just mentioned is that the data that you pull on foster youth is only as good as the degree to which your foster youth checkbox is accurate. So if your foster youth checkbox is not actually representing who the foster youth are, then of course the data that you pull is not going to be data that is in fact for foster youth. So the first step is taking a look at your foster youth checkbox, looking at that data element, figuring out how it's populated, and refining how it's populated to make it as accurate as possible. We here at the John Burton Foundation have a recommended way that you go about doing this. Most campuses rely on what is indicated on the application through CCC Apply. So applicants indicate on CCC Apply if they are foster youth or if they're not. And then a lot of campuses simply transfer that information into the foster youth checkbox. This is relying 100% on self-report and is not going to necessarily give you the most accurate information, in part because some foster youth choose not to identify themselves on CCC Apply. They fear either that there's going to be some stigma attached to identifying themselves, or they've been in the system for a long time, they're really ready to just leave the system behind and start afresh. And so they say, I don't want them to think of me as a foster youth. I don't want to be identified that way. And so they don't check it off. In other situations, some people do check it off when they're not a foster youth because maybe they don't understand. They grew up with their grandmother, but they weren't actually in the foster care system, or they were in a guardianship, but not technically in foster care. And so it can get very nuanced, and people don't necessarily know if they're a foster youth or not. So what we recommend is that you actually combine a number of different sources together to populate this data flag. So you take the information from CCC Apply, you look at the information from the FAFSA, in particular question number 53, which asks, have you been in the foster care system since the age of 13? You look at who has applied for a Chafee grant. You look at who in EOPS has identified themselves as a foster youth, because you may have people who don't check the box on CCC Apply, but when it comes to their FAFSA and they're told, you have to check this box to get independent status for financial aid, then they're going to realize, oh, there's actually a huge benefit to me doing this, and they will check it off on the FAFSA, or they will identify themselves that way to EOPS because EOPS informs them that they can get priority registration, whereas they didn't check off the box when they were just completing their application initially. So what we recommend is that you pull from all of these different sources, create a master list of everybody who's on any one of these sources, and that's the information that you use to populate that foster youth checkbox. Then there's the question of verification. Typically, colleges don't have the resources to verify each one of these people and determine if they're foster youth or not. So we recommend that if it's not feasible to verify all of the foster youth, that you do just accept their word, accept the self-report. If you do decide you're going to verify foster youth status, we recommend that you allow for multiple forms of verification. Different counties provide verification in different ways, and that you make several attempts of reaching out to a student before you de-identify a student. And just as a reminder, this recommendation that we're offering is for the purposes of data collection. There's all kinds of, there's the identifying foster youth for financial aid, there's identifying foster youth for priority registration, there might be identifying foster youth for a foster youth services program that you're operating, and you may have different standards in terms of the verification that you require. For the purpose of checking off that box, that's what you're going to use to pull your data from, we recommend you err on the side of over-counting rather than under-counting, essentially, so that you make sure you're not missing people who are in fact foster youth. Next slide. So obtaining the data. For the first area, access, the definition of the data that you're supposed to be obtaining is a percentage of each population group, in this case foster youth, who are enrolled compared to that group's representation in the adult population within the community served. This, quite frankly, is going to be one of the harder ones to really get accurate data on, but I wanted to let you know about some resources that you might be able to turn to for this. You can pull the number of foster youth enrolled on your campus through Data Mart. So if you go to the Special Populations Report, foster youth is included as a special population, and you can see the number. And if you pull that number, and it seems, if you talk to your foster youth point person and they say, oh, this is saying we have 50 foster youth, I personally know that we have 150, then you want to go back to that checkbox again and see how that checkbox is being populated to be more accurate. To get numbers, information about the numbers of foster youth in your county, there's a couple of links there. And as a reminder, I am going to be sending this out to everybody, so you don't need to write these down. You can pull a report that shows the current number of foster youth in your county by age. So you can see how many foster youth are there in the 18 to 21 age group, for example. You can also look at foster youth exits within your county to get a sense of how many former foster youth are likely in your county between certain ages. And your child welfare agency may be able to provide other data. So the child welfare agencies actually have to do an outcomes report called the SOC 405, where they have to track various transition information, including participation in college. So you can get in touch with them and see if they might be able to help you with some of this information. Next slide, please. Course completion. So this one, I'm happy to say, is the easiest of them, although I should have mentioned at the beginning with the CalPAS Plus report, the CalPAS Plus report does not disaggregate by gender. So unfortunately, the way it's structured right now, it provides the information just by, for the entire foster youth population. So with course completion, it's defined as the ratio of the number of credit courses that students complete compared to the number of courses which students in that group are enrolled. And so this is actually available through CalPAS Plus. If you pull that out, the CalPAS Plus report, you'll see right there it gives you a percentage of course completion. So that's the most straightforward of the data points in terms of being able to get it through CalPAS Plus. Next slide. Basic skills completion. So the foster youth checkbox went into effect pretty recently, and so the data that is available through CalPAS Plus, the cohort tracking piece of that, the first cohort tracked was the 12-13 cohort. And then as we move on through time, additional cohorts will be added year to year. The hope is that in October, by October, the 13-14 cohort will be added to CalPAS Plus, as well as some follow-up data from the 12-13 cohort. But the basic skills completion is a tricky one because since foster youth tracking is relatively recent, the CalPAS Plus report doesn't have information about actual basic skills completion. Now, you can obtain information from the report about how many foster youth are enrolled in basic skills compared to the general student population. So that can be a really valuable data indicator because it might give you a sense of whether you need to designate tutors for your foster youth population and that type of thing. But otherwise, in terms of actual basic skills completion, that would be something you would need to obtain through local campus data. Next slide. Completion and transfer. So again, we sort of run into the same issue that I described with the basic skills completion. Because the CalPAS Plus report just started doing cohort tracking as of 12-13, we don't have completion or transfer data yet. However, a couple of things that you can look at that could be helpful. The report does provide information about the percent of foster youth making satisfactory academic progress. So this is something that you can certainly look at as an interim indicator. If you see that the percent of foster youth who are not making satisfactory academic progress is much higher than the general student population, then you can extrapolate from that it is likely that you're going to see lower completion and transfer numbers down the line. So that should be a useful piece of information in terms of planning the activities that you want to do related to completion and transfer. In addition, because this first report is just for 12-13, we don't have a data point yet that shows how many foster youth complete 3 consecutive terms. But once we start tracking and being able to report the 13-14 cohort, that will be a data point that you'll see on the report, the percent completing 3 consecutive terms. So again, that's another great interim indicator that can give you a sense of where your foster youth population is related to likely completion and transfer. Next slide. So I wanted to mention quickly the crosswalk guide. In equity planning guidance provided by the Chancellor's Office, there's a crosswalk guide where there's a bunch of questions listed to help you think about planning. So in the, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, there's a foster youth equity planning template that the John Burton Foundation produced that you may have already seen, and we will certainly send it out to everybody after the end of the web seminar, that provides all of this information that we're going over is in this foster youth equity planning template. And one of the documents is a template specifically related to foster youth. So next slide. And this simply asks questions such as, is your campus conducting outreach that targets foster youth to some of those programs that I mentioned earlier, like your child welfare agency or independent living program? Are your foster youth actually able to access priority enrollment? Do you have a foster youth advisory committee? Are foster youth more likely to end up on academic probation, and what are you doing to try to decrease this? Are students who place into basic skills less likely to enroll and complete the next course in the sequence? Do foster youth respond to early alerts by accessing services? And this is, these are really important questions to think about, because if you say, okay, our foster youth are not doing well in terms of course completion and academic progress, so we're going to really ramp up our early alert system for them, you want to look at then, do they respond to early alerts? If you're just sending early alerts by email, are you getting a response? And if the answer is no, then that's not going to be an effective activity to actually move the dial on this, and you'll have to look at something different. Next slide, please. So moving into activities. So now that you've got all your data and you've taken a look at it and you've figured out exactly where your foster youth stand in terms of access and completion and basic skills and transfer and all of these things, what are you going to do about it? Chances are, if your campus is at all similar to the data that we've seen thus far and from statewide data on foster youth, you're probably going to find that your foster youth are lagging behind in all of these indicators. That is the most likely scenario. So we're going to go through activities for each one of the 5 areas. So access. A major issue for foster youth in terms of access is not knowing about matriculation requirements, not knowing where to start, not knowing who to turn to, just having no idea what to do. One thing that you hear from folks who work on campuses who are foster youth contacts is that foster youth show up 3 days before school starts and say, I want to go to college. And it's too late at that point for them to enroll in the fall, and they get discouraged and they don't come back in the spring. So getting the information out there to foster youth well in advance about what they need to do to make it into college is really crucial. So ways that you can do that. You can do a college access trainings for foster care providers. So you can conduct trainings with your county child welfare social workers, or with the independent living program staff, or with those group homes and other foster care providers that we talked about earlier, to educate them about matriculation requirements to make sure that they're passing that information along to the foster youth that they work with. Secondly, a lot of foster youth believe college is not for them. They got a lot of negative messages growing up, perhaps from both their biological family and the foster care system, where people said, you know, you've got a learning disability, or, you know, you're gonna, if you can just make it through high school and get a job, you're doing well. Don't think about college. And so they need to hear that actually they can go to college, they can be successful, it is for them. And so working with, say, your independent living program to do a foster youth college day, where the ILP program brings their foster youth to the campus, they get to learn about financial aid, they get to see the campus environment, they get to see that, in fact, the students on that campus are not that different from them. And they start to think, no, maybe I could go to college. Conducting visits directly with the high schools to meet with foster youth. So again, working with those foster youth liaisons who know who the foster youth are at their high school to coordinate visits directly at the high schools that are targeted to foster youth. And when you do visits like that that are targeted to foster youth, then you can make sure you let them know about checking off question number 53 on the FAFSA and how they access priority enrollment, and maybe spend a little time on sort of resources that might be available related to housing and some of the things that are going to be of specific interest to foster youth. You can sponsor a financial aid night specifically for foster youth, and you can give priority access if your campus has a summer bridge program. You can do specific outreach to the foster youth population to make sure they know about the summer bridge and give them priority access so that they are certain to be able to have access to such a program. Next slide. And so what are you hoping to achieve from this? You do have to specify the outcomes that you're going to be looking for. So for example, with access, you might say that by 2020, foster youth will enroll at the college at rates equal to your general population. Or you might look at it a different way and say the number of foster youth enrolled at the college will increase by 10% per year. Or that between this year and 2017, the number of foster youth enrolled is going to go up from 126 currently to 200 by 2017-18. So there are different ways to look at this. Next slide. Course completion. So a few ideas for this. Priority access to matriculation services. This is primarily to make sure that foster youth can complete the matriculation process in time to access priority enrollment, as it's now a requirement that they complete this in order to access priority enrollment. Setting aside EOPS slots. So if you look at the statewide data, and this is actually something that you can get from the CalPAS Plus report, you can see the percentage of foster youth who participate in EOPS, TRIO, and the disabled student services. And we have seen that the participation in EOPS among foster youth is very, very low, surprisingly low, given the fact that almost all, if not all, foster youth are going to be meet the basic eligibility requirements for the program. So setting aside EOPS slots specifically for foster youth, because one reason they don't access the program is they don't know about it, and by the time they arrive on campus and hear about it, the program's already full. Second reason that a lot of foster youth don't access EOPS is because they simply do not have the academic skills to attend full-time initially. And so it's not in their best interest to enroll full-time, because we see foster youth enroll full-time in order to get financial aid benefits, and they fail out and they don't come back. And so a lot of times we actually encourage them to start a little slower initially, maybe just enroll in 9 units for their first term to acclimate and have a chance to learn study skills. And so EOPS programs can waive that full-time requirement for up to 10% of participants and allow those participants to enter at 9 units. So making sure to prioritize foster youth for that waiver, and then making sure that if a foster youth has a disability, that they're connected with the Disabled Students Program as well, which can also then help facilitate access to EOPS. Finally, funding a foster youth one-stop shop on campus. So this is really the gold standard, I would say, for improving foster youth outcomes. And if you're a program in particular, that if you're a campus that you have one of these light touch programs, you have a little bit of a program, but it's not really an established program because they don't have any funding to do so, using some of the money that's going to be coming through the equity plan funding allocation to fund a person who can operate a one-stop shop where foster youth can come and get a range of resources, get referrals, get access to tutoring, academic counseling, etc. There's a number of campuses now that have these programs, and they're very, very successful. And I would encourage everybody to think about trying to establish some kind of targeted foster youth program on your campus. We actually have a resource for this, a guide that walks you through step by step how to establish a campus support program. And so when I send the email out after this web seminar, I will include a link to that guide so you can have that information. Next slide. So some of the outcomes, the first three above the green line are indicators that could lead to improvements in course completion. So for example, 100% of foster youth will have a comprehensive education plan in place. The number of foster youth participating in EOPS will increase. The percent of foster youth who access priority registration will increase. So these are not course completion outcomes per se, but they are things that are known to positively impact course completion. And then, of course, your actual course completion outcomes, you can look at it a couple different ways. Either the percentage is going to go up for course completion, or there's another indicator that's on the CalPAS Plus report in terms of the number who successfully complete 3 consecutive terms. Next slide. Activities for basic skills, funding tutors specifically for foster youth. In particular, if you have a foster youth support program, and when you talk with them, they say, boy, if we had additional funding, one of the things we'd love to be able to have is tutors here 2 days a week to help students who are in basic skills courses with basic math and English. And so if that is one of the needs that's identified by your foster youth support program, if you have one, then that would be a great way to use some of these resources. Another way that some campuses have gone about supporting foster youth is doing a student success course specifically for foster youth, where they get credit and they learn about study skills, how to talk to a professor, how to develop good study habits, and learn about campus resources, etc. And finally, doing some training with your faculty about the specialized needs of foster youth. And this is another area where the John Burton Foundation has some very specific resources for this. We have a whole training curriculum with presentation slides, activities, a trainer's guide for how you can deliver training specifically for faculty and staff about the needs of foster youth. So I will send that link out as well. And it's all posted online, and anybody who's interested can download it and use it in full or in part to educate your faculty and staff. Next slide. Outcomes, again, pretty straightforward. You're looking at the percentage of first-time foster youth who began below transfer level and complete a college level course within 6 years. And you can look at it as either that you want your foster youth numbers to match your general student population numbers, or you can look at specific increase. We want the numbers to go up by some certain percentage. Next slide. Completion. So ideas are doing outreach to foster youth at risk of not making satisfactory academic progress. I encourage folks to do at least 2 different forms of contact. So email and a phone call, or phone call and a text, because we know that in particular with email, students don't necessarily check their email these days. Every campus has a foster youth success initiative liaison. A way to use some of these resources is to actually reduce that person's general population caseload with some of the money that's available, so that they can actually have some dedicated time to work with foster youth. Because a lot of them are just doing this on top of their regular caseload in the financial aid department. And so that can be very challenging. You can fund an academic counselor. So again, if you have a foster youth services program, having some academic counseling time in that program, or if you don't, having somebody designated that foster youth know is a point person for them within the academic counseling staff. Conducting a pre-registration event to ensure that foster youth are aware of priority registration dates and prepared to register. Getting everything in place for them ahead of time so that when priority registration dates comes, they're all set and ready and they don't discover that, in fact, there was all kinds of things they needed to do that they didn't realize. Next slide. Again, in terms of what you're going to be looking at for outcomes, there's a couple different ways to look at it. One is comparing the rate of completion for foster youth to that of the general student population, or you can look at increases, although it's a little trickier with this because we don't have a lot of great baseline data at this point on completion rates. Next slide. So transfer activities. Some ideas here. Sponsor an annual foster youth transition day, where you take the foster youth on your campus to visit some of the local four-year universities. We've seen campuses do this. It's very, very effective. They get to meet almost every single CSU and UC has a foster youth point person. In most cases, a foster youth program, in fact. And so you can connect with them. The students can learn who that point person is. They can see the campus. It can be a very encouraging opportunity for the foster youth. Designating somebody in your career and transfer center as a point person for foster youth, doing career shadow days and job skills workshop, or prioritizing foster youth for work study positions. Next slide. Again, the outcomes similar to completion. There's different ways to look at it, comparing the rate of transfer to the general population, or looking at your baseline transfer rate and deciding how many percentage points you want to see that increase by. Next slide. So that's a very quick run through of some activities. Of course, you're not going to do everything, and it's going to vary by campus depending on what your needs are. We encourage you to make sure to incorporate activities in each one of the 5 areas that are specific to foster youth. We've talked a lot about why foster youth have some very specific needs and some specific disadvantages. And so the reason they're called out here is because we have found it's not that effective to just lump them in with a low-income population and hope that the programs meet their needs, because the needs often are very different. The last piece of the planning process is the budgeting piece. So as Sarah talked about, the Chancellor's Office is going to be providing information about each campus's total allotment, their share of this $70 million pie. And to really make the foster youth component of this real, of course, it's going to take dedicating some of those resources to the activities that you decide to do, and whether that's funding tutors or funding a new academic counselor or creating a whole full-time staff person to work at your foster youth campus support program. Most of these campus support programs exist through external fundraising, through philanthropy, and they have to dedicate an extraordinary amount of their time to just stay afloat. And so to be able to dedicate some campus resources to support the staff time so that those folks can actually focus their energies on working with students and not have to focus so much of their energies going out and trying to raise funds will be a huge benefit to the foster youth on their campus. And you want to make sure that the amount of funds that you choose to allocate towards these activities are adequate to complete the activities that you name in your equity plan. Next slide. So that is the presentation. There is contact information on there for myself if you have questions specifically about the foster youth planning template. In addition, Deborah Sheldon at the Chancellor's Office, her contact information is there, and she is the person who you would contact for more general student equity questions. So we've had quite a few questions come in, and we've got a good chunk of time to be able to go through them. So Sarah, I'm assuming you're still around, because I'm going to direct this first question to you. So the question is about the makeup of the Student Equity Committee. If the committee on your campus is made up of faculty only, is this an issue?
If the committee, the Student Equity Committee, is made up of faculty only, is that an issue?
Yes.
Is that the question?
That is correct.
Well, I guess it would depend on whether I, that's a little tricky because it would depend on where the faculty are, what areas of the faculty are employed. There's a requirement to include faculty, academic faculty, student services, students that is now in the statute. So it doesn't sound like it is quite broad enough. So that college might want to kind of take a look at that requirement again and ensure that they are covering all of those areas that are outlined by the statute.
Great, thank you. So I have another question for you, and it's kind of a technical question. The question is, in terms of doing the data collection, can we simply use our scorecard data and cohorts for this? He says we should be able to match foster youth student IDs to identify which scorecard students are foster youth. Do you know if that's possible?
I haven't had a conversation with Debbie Sheldon about using the scorecard data per se, but it does not seem. So I might have to come back to that, but that seems like it would fit with. It seems like that would fit with the kind of analysis that you need to do, but that because I'm not that familiar with the way the scorecard data is broken out and whether there's all that level of detail. But if the institution thinks that they have that level of detail in their scorecard data, then they probably do. So it probably would work. But again, it does need to be part of your overall analysis, needs to include the disproportionate impact.
Right.
And,
so next,
sorry, I'm sorry, Debbie, and we're capturing these questions, correct, so that we can do a Q&A?
Yes, all these questions are being recorded. So
okay, great.
In fact, if we don't get to your question, if you sent one in, we will take all these questions and do a Q&A and send it out. So the next question is, are campuses supposed to develop goals and activities for each student group per success indicator?
Again, that's getting a little bit more into the detail than we have discussed here at the Chancellor's office. So I think that the analysis is going to have to look at how each group is doing as compared to other groups, and whether or not they are having less success at each indicator. Correct? I'm trying to say that in two negatives, and I'm not doing it very well. So I do think the analysis needs to look at each one of those subgroups.
Right. So if in one of the particular areas, let's say you look at basic skills completion and the particular group like foster youth or veterans is doing just fine, there is no disproportionate impact, you wouldn't need to do any activities. But if your study shows that there is disproportionate impact, you would need to include some activities.
Or maybe in access, maybe you're finding that veterans are accessing post-secondary, accessing your college just fine, but low-income students aren't. Well, whether there technically overlap between your veterans and low-income is another question. But maybe you find that veterans are accessing just fine, but other groups are not accessing. So then you wouldn't need to have, there wouldn't be activities that would support the veterans accessing it. There would be activities that would support you increasing access for other groups.
Right. Great. Next question, can student equity funds supplant general funds on campus?
No.
Okay. There you go. Easy answer to that. For the student equity plan, is there a definition of foster youth? For example, age, range, status, etc.?
We don't have. There's nothing in the statute that specifically defines foster youth. for purposes of student equity planning. So for purposes of student equity planning, I think what you, Debbie Browsher, has laid out is a way of looking at foster youth fairly broadly and being as inclusive as possible. So that would be my recommendation. But there's no narrow definition in the education code around the student equity planning.
Great. So there's one question that I will take, which is somebody's inquiring about whether there's an initiative or bill to provide services to foster youth under EOPS. So I will clarify that yes, there is a bill, SB 1023, that is looking to identify some additional resources to provide additional services to foster youth under EOPS. That initiative is separate from the equity planning, and we don't know yet whether that bill is going to succeed or fail. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But if it does, any funding that would be associated with that would be in addition to this. And so you certainly would want to be coordinating the efforts if that bill passes and the campus gets that funding, but they really are separate initiatives. Here's a question, I don't know if you can answer this or not, Sarah, but does the CCO plan to add these different demographic filters to the special population, course retention, and other data metrics on the data mart?
Well, that's kind of a I kind of have probably a two-part answer. Right now, as you know, we did add that special populations file a couple of years ago, and the special populations file, excuse me, collects foster youth status veterans. Actually, it collects inmate ed or incarcerated students, and it collects like Mesa, Puente, a whole bunch of those things. So that special pop file is out there and it's being reported to us. So it's available for use. I just can't remember at the moment how that's all integrated into the data mart side. I know you can pull up a file that you can get counts of those special populations by term, but we don't have a real comprehensive report on that yet. But the colleges should have access to that information on their side and in the data on demand. So it's kind of a two-part answer because the information, we are collecting information. It's not as robust as I would like it to be. We still think that both foster youth and veterans are being underreported somewhat, and I absolutely think that I actually think incarcerated students might be being underreported as well. So to the extent that colleges can really focus on improving that reporting, then that's really going to help us at the statewide level. And then we could look at doing some other special runs that colleges would have access to with their own login IDs. I hope that was helpful.
So we've got a couple of people who are wanting additional clarification again on the gender piece. So I think it's actually worth repeating the answer to this question about, so the question is, please confirm that we are to compare gender performance within groups as well as between groups. For example, we compare foster youth male to foster youth female performance rates and then compare foster youth performance rates to the rest of the population in general. Or do we compare foster youth females to general population females, etc.? Or is it not? Yeah, go ahead.
That's very interesting. I'm not sure that when they wrote the language about, so I'm repeating the question because I'm no longer on speaker in the room, and so the question is about gender and whether, let me see if I can restate it. The question is about gender and whether you compare foster youth males compared to foster youth females, or whether you compare foster youth females to the general population females. So I don't think when they wrote the language in the statute that they were parsing it that specifically. They just they just said they actually list gender first, and then they actually say you need to do your study based on gender, and then they list all those subpopulations and the ethnic and racial category. So I think I think the colleges need to do what's reasonable, and I think, I mean, using foster youth as an example, I'm quite sure that you will find that you know, foster youth access to higher ed is disproportionately low compared to all enrollment in higher ed, regardless of the gender, right? But I think you could probably do it either way. I think I think the colleges need to do what makes sense to them in terms of organizing the research.
Great.
But we will try to follow up and try and think through that a little bit more and clarify that.
So we've got a couple of people writing in expressing concern about the amount of research that has to be done within the time frame, and want to know, is there any likelihood of there being an extension?
An extension for submitting the plan?
Correct.
There's already some provision about submission of the plan that I think we walked through that the initial version of the plan can really actually speak to updating the plan later on. I'm pretty sure that was in one of those slides that we did. And the legislation itself provides an opportunity for colleges to basically submit a statement, a high-level statement to the Chancellor's office about their planning process, just to ensure that they can meet that criteria in the first year to receive funding. We have not yet resolved the issue about whether we're going to, as I mentioned earlier, whether we're going to extend the November deadline, but we understand that this first plan, and we've talked about this actually since all spring, all summer, that this first plan is likely to be kind of initial take on it, and that you are going to need to update this plan in the next year. And so that's actually what we'll be expecting colleges to be doing. That part of that work will be articulating how you're going to do your research and how you're going to establish your metrics for the plan, and then do your annual report to us. So we're kind of expecting that some of these plans are going to, in a way, be plans to plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One sort of clarifying question to that: if campus does need to revise their plan, does that impact the amount of funding that they receive?
If they need to revise their plan, does that impact the amount of funding? I don't anticipate that there will be a direct correlation between the plan and the funding, except to the extent that you don't.
The funding is determined by formula.
The funding is determined by formula. If you don't submit the documents to the Chancellor's office, then that could affect the funding, but not the fact that they need to revise the plan.
Somebody wants me to repeat the number of the bill that would allow additional funds for foster youth under EOPS. So that is Senate Bill 1023. SB 1023. Question about accountability and what's in place related to accountability. How is the Chancellor's office going to be tracking whether or not the money that is allocated, say, for foster youth resources is actually put towards those resources? So that was literally the question. How is the Chancellor's office going to track the fund? It says, how do we know if the money that is allocated for foster youth resources are being put towards those resources? What if the Equity Planning Committee chooses to not put the funds directly to the foster youth resources? So if the equity plans do not reflect metrics around, so I'm anticipating this, and I'm not the program expert on this. That would be Deborah Sheldon.
but it's my assumption that if the college's plans do not reflect an analysis of all the subpopulations and steps to improve their outcomes, that those plans will not be considered to be very robust. But beyond that, when the state puts out money like this $70 million, the state is going to be looking for improved outcomes. And I can tell you that just at the Chancellor's office alone, we have enough information to be able to tell whether outcomes are improving through the whole Student Success Initiative, as well as for the student equity funding. So I think there's going to be a fair amount of scrutiny on what the districts are accomplishing with these funds. And I guess I would say that colleges should be really looking at the legislation is quite detailed, and colleges should be looking at improving outcomes for all the populations that do not have very good outcomes. And if that doesn't happen, the state will probably take the money in whole. So, you know, it would be unwise to, you know, sort of jeopardize your opportunity to use those funds by not really looking at serving all those populations that you need to be serving.
Great. Another question is, if a campus has a campus-based support program for foster youth, can they use student equity money to fund some basic items like creating an emergency fund, filling housing gaps?
I would have to get back to you on that.
Okay. So we'll include that in the FAQ to follow.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, we're getting close to the end of time, the end of our time, not the end of all time. One question, somebody wants to know, the Center for Urban Education at USC created a one-page template related to equity planning, and they're wondering if they're allowed to use that. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Is that from Estella Ben-Simone's shop?
No.
No, I'm not familiar with it then.
Okay. So I would say to be on the safe side, you're probably better using the template provided by the Chancellor's office for your equity plan. So we're pretty much at the end of time. If we didn't get to your question, definitely feel free to send me an email directly, and I can research and see what I can figure out for you. And we are going to take these questions and try to put together some kind of FAQ for folks so that we have the answers to these questions documented, in particular the ones where we weren't quite sure what the answer was. So I want to say a huge thank you, Sarah, for being on the call and presenting all this great information. Everybody should look for an email coming probably either later today or tomorrow with links and various resources that we talked about. And thank you all very much for being on this call.
And I would just like to thank the John Burton Foundation and Debbie Rauscher for all of their excellent work around this issue and the excellent examples that they've provided. I think the items that they provided as sample activities are very actionable and actually can apply not only to foster youth, but could apply to many of the populations that need to be specified and addressed by the student equity plan. So I think you can look at those as examples not only for foster youth, but you can look at those as examples of activities at other areas as well. And so really thank you so much, Debbie and Devin, for all of your work on this. It's very helpful.
Great. Thank you very much. Goodbye.